history, and how long you've lived in Hernando County.
Okay, my name is Bob Martinez or Martinez, depending on what you're accustomed to. I was born in New York City on June 12, 1945. I was only 12 years old, but we moved to Brooksville, and I've lived here ever since.
What part of the county did you live in?
I live right in the heart of Brooksville.
Right in
My parents ran a motel business at the bottom of the hill on Broad Street and Jefferson Street, the corner of Bell Avenue. It was called the El Motel. It was in our family for almost 20 years. And so I've seen some changes. I've seen when Brooksville was vital with tourism and so forth over the years. But I have lived in Brooksville proper since 1957.
And what was it like back then, coming from New York, as many did, but not as early as you did? Do you remember some of your first impressions, or just in general, any of some of your earliest memories?
It was lonely at first, and it took me a while to get acclimated. I think the biggest thing I remember when I left, my uncle, who was also born in Tampa, said, "Bobby, you be careful now. Them young cracker boys down there, they're pretty tough." And I said, they can hunt and fish and climb trees and all this kind of stuff. And of course, we didn't do that in Manhattan, but we did have Central Park though. But it was it was a bit of a cultural shock. But in due time, you find out that the kids are the same wherever you go, all over the nation. We all like the same things. We all wanted to watch the same TV shows. We love sports. We love cars. The one thing I noticed is when I moved down here in 1957, you still have some residue from the Civil War, believe it or not, even though it had been 90 years removed. Half of the kids call me Yank or Yankee. There were very few Northerners living here, or what you say, Yankees. And I guess I stuck out like a sore thumb because, I'd start coming to school with navy blue pleated pants and white shirts, and because I went to a private school in New York City. It was a Catholic school, so we had to dress up nice. Down here, they were wearing jeans and just real laid back, and so I got into a few scrapes, and I remember one time they took me, a bunch of kids, and it was like a scene out of the Rifleman or something, where they push you around and they threw me in a bunch of dirt with my new shirt and everything. And I just got up, and I said, "Mom, I can't dress like this. These kids are dressed different." So I started wearing jeans and just regular t-shirt, polo shirts or casual shirts, and I had one kid come up to me, I'll never forget. He says, "Now you got it right. Now you got it Southern style." I was only here maybe about 6 weeks or so. So, some of the kids give you a hard time. So I came back and I had a rough day, and I was in the back, and I guess tears were welling up in my eyes. And one of the boys in the class said to our homeroom teacher, Mrs. Lofton, "Miss Lofton, Yank's crying." And so she came over and says, "Well, what's wrong?" And they took me outside, and I told her, they're picking on me. They call me Yankee and all this. And Miss McNeil came out, and she says, "Well, what's wrong with him?" He says, "Well, they're calling him Yankee, and they're picking on him because he's a Yankee." And she says, "My goodness, but the war's been over now 90 years. So it was still fresh in her mind. And funny incident was when I first moved here, my relatives took me to Webb City in St. Petersburg. Webb City was called the world's most unusual drugstore. And it was one giant entire city block, and it had everything under one roof. It was like Walmart, only probably about 5 times bigger. I was new to the area, and I didn't know, so I saw 2 water fountains. One of them said colored, and the other one said white. Well, I said, I know that regular water. I'll try this colored water. Maybe it's cherry flavor or orange. And I started walking to it, and my cousin grabbed me and said, "No, Bobby, that's not for you. It's this one." So that was my first experience with the segregation. Of course, at school, it was all segregated. The African Americans had Moton High School, and all the sports teams were all white kids, and we never really assimilated. What we used to do, though, after games, we would go down to Moton High and see them play football, because it was a faster breed of football. The players were usually smaller, but they were like lightning. And even college athletics, I went to the University of Florida. The team was completely white. The players were a lot slower. The whole Southeastern Conference was white. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until around 1968 when you started seeing, and that's the year I graduated, that you started seeing integration in the schools. And here, it didn't come about till 1966. I'll make a reference to that in the latest issue of Old Brooksville, which is I'm the publisher of, and I had a friend of mine I graduated from the other day, and he'd gone on to we graduated together, and he'd gone on to work in Houston, then he went to California, and then he came back here, and he expressed some of the happiest moments of his life was when we got together, like on a Saturday, and we'd get down to my place, and we had a tape recorder, and we'd tape and horse around and play music, and then we'd walk down to this place down here at the bottom of Jefferson Street called Hilburn's Record Shop, and they had all the latest hit records, and that was a different thing back then too. In the late 50s and early 60s, you had hit songs. AM radio was very, very big with the teens. You had top 40 surveys, and the kids bought 45s as singles. And
remember how much a 45 cost?
oh yes, they were 89 cents or so.
Nice. How much would the player be?
The albums were $2.99 for mono and $3.99 for stereo.
And how much for the actual player that would play that?
It depends how much you want to go. I think most average is probably about a good one, about $100, $120 or so.
So they were expensive.
And you know, if you really wanted a good sound, you could probably, I'm sure you could get one as cheap as $50 or $60. But they were strictly disc. You know, there was no cassettes, there was no 8-tracks, there was no iPads or anything like iPods. And so people just the society and the culture, the teenage culture revolved around the 45 single. And of course you had the early greats of rock and roll with Elvis and Fats Domino, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry. This is pre-Beatles stuff, the Four Seasons, doo-wop bands. This area did not get their first TV station until 1954. And it was based out of Tampa, and I mentioned that in this issue. And by 1958, you had all three networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC. And in 59, you got an educational station, and it wasn't anything like what you have now. It was pretty much like your educational TV was an algebra class, literally.
Boring.
And boring. Oh, God, yeah, and black and white. But TV was black and white. You could get 2 or 3 channels, network, and everybody gathered around in the evening and watched the shows. Mm-hmm. And the next morning, we'd all talk about it. Did you see Red Skelton last night? Did you see Wagon Train? And on Sunday, you got one football game. And the football games back then, the regional team, it's hard to believe, was the Washington Redskins, because that was the southernmost team.
What year was this about?
This is like 1959, 60, 61. And I didn't see the first TV, color TV until 1962.
Mm-hmm.
I went over to a friend's house, and the brand new show started in the fall that year, and it was Johnny Carson with The Tonight Show. On the weekends, we'd get together with other guys from the neighborhood. We call them city guys, us. And we'd grab a bat and a ball, and we'd go down to Emerson Field and play baseball. And this is during the summer.
It's hot.
Yeah, but we go early in the morning, and it's like the field of dreams. You still remember the smell of the dew in the morning grass, and you're 15 years old, and the only thing you care about is sports or cars or girls.
Right.
I really do think that the kids are pretty much the same everywhere. I think one thing that's made it that way is television.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most popular TV programs from 1958 through when I graduated was a show called American Bandstand with Dick Clark. It was based out of Philadelphia, but the kids there saw all the songs. I mean, they heard all the songs they like. They saw the kids dancing. They saw what they wore, and it really helped spread the style and the culture. Prior to the mid-50s, or I'd say around 56, 57, most American culture was dominated by adults. That included not only music, but movies and television. And you started seeing the advent of a youthful culture with people like Elvis. Was that between 1956 and 1958, a total of 2.5 years, he was every week in the top 5.
Wow.
And that gives you an idea that he changed the course of pop music history, whether you like him or not.
Oh yeah.
He changed the course of pop music history, and then of course with the Beatles in 1964, they changed the course of pop music and made the album the thing instead of the single. I think that's where music and taste change. But what I'm telling you is it didn't matter if you were in Texas or California or New York or Florida. All the kids shared in the same likes. And I don't think you saw that in the 30s and 40s. I think you had a lot of regional stuff that was pervious to just your area if you grew up in Alabama or if you grew up in Texas. And television, and to some extent some radio, has made the country smaller, actually.
Along with that, can you think of any other events or things like that, like the television, radio, the American Bandstand, or anything simply local that may have determined the direction in which the community here went, the way that the county changed?
I think that the area, because of its rural nature, has always put a good emphasis on local sports. You did not see the fanaticism for football up north that you did when I came down south. And I was a bit confused because I come from a baseball climate. New Yorkers love baseball. And football at that time was an afterthought, And not very really big in the college up there. It was mostly, if they did follow it, it was professional. As I come down here, and there's fanatical following about the high school teams, the Hernando Leopards. And I remember they used to give out these decals that you put them on your car, and they were a football decal. And it was bright purple with gold letters and said Hernando Leopards. And I said, well, those are cool. I got to get one of those, So all the guys, they'd put them on their cars, their windows, and they had the schedule on the back. But it was a big deal, You'd have crowds of 2,000 showing up for games,
Wow.
I mentioned right in this book, 1965, to me is a pivotal sea change in not only the economic development of the city and the county, but tourism as well. Prior to 1965, the major arteries for travel into Brooksville were US 41, US 98. Tourists would come all the way from Detroit, New York, Cleveland, all the way down to see the tourist attractions in Florida. And one of the biggest ones we had was Weeki Wachee. Now, like I said, my parents ran a motel, and we would get people from Canada, as far as Canada, that come all the way down here to see Weeki Wachee. And it's kind of hard to believe, but when you're talking late 50s, early 60s, up until the mid-60s, all the tourist travel came through Brooksville. So what happened was, in 1965, you had two events that really changed the economic complexion of the city. And 2 years later, I want to say Spring Hill. Mm-hmm. But what it was the building of I-75.
Do you recall what year that was?
1965.
Okay.
It opened around June of 1965. Okay. Now all the tourists bypass Brooksville. And then the other event, I considered it a slow mass exodus from downtown with the building of the two major shopping centers south of here at that time. You had Brook Plaza and Hernando Plaza. The Publix, which was downtown, moved down there. Shoe stores, drugstores. It completely changed the economic picture downtown. The entire city was based on business downtown. If you grew up, it was like a Norman Rockwell painting. It was, you had your drug stores, you had your clothing stores, your grocery stores, mm-hmm. and people would walk. Sometimes if you lived in the city, you could walk to downtown and get your groceries, or take a cab or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I started seeing that change at the same time, 1965. The start of shopping centers and strip malls. And another event in 1966, you had the first franchise arrive.
Which was?
The A&W. It was very, very popular for their root beer, of course, and their burgers. And the teens would drive through. It was this car hop, they just drive through and check everybody out and all. Well, I was already out of high school then, but it was immensely popular. And you had had some other places which had been around as restaurants, but they were all individual. But that was the first. But that opened up the floodgates for all other franchises to follow, including KFC a couple of years later, McDonald's in 1976, and before that you had a little thing called Biff Burger. I'd say within 10 to 15 years after the first franchise arrived, the whole landscape changed, and you had the Wendy's, the Arby's, the Golden Corrals, the Burger Kings, and when all this happened, I was 20 years old, and I was away at college, so I saw it happen, and I just said, well, that's progress. I really didn't think anything of it. And it was exciting, really, because you say, oh, wow, now we got a shopping center. We're like a big town, and we got two, actually. And the shopping centers, one of them had, like I said, the Publix. The other one had the Winn-Dixie, and they had a Sears, and they had a Rexall drugstore, and shoe stores, Neissner's, 5 and 10s, restaurants, and it was quite... It was quite a change, and it was exciting because it was all new. Mm-hmm. So, but I think that those two key events, the building of the shopping centers and the building of I-75, mm-hmm. It's really triggered a sea change in our economy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And it's sad because a lot of these businesses, not just motels, but a lot of businesses benefited from tourists. A lot of people had to reinvent themselves. I was also in a band. I don't know if I told you that.
You did not.
One of the most popular things that was going on right about the same time that I said about 1965 was Beatlemania. Now every small town and every major town, Tampa, Orlando, St. Pete, Jacksonville, they had their rock bands. And we had one. I was in one called the Cavemen. And I was with Frankie Springstead, Alonzo Merritt, and Pete Shingleton. So surprisingly, we just got together, and within a month, we were booking 3 shows a week.
Wow.
And we played from St. Petersburg to Gainesville. Wow. And most of the time, we'd play around Brooksville, Dade City, Crystal River, Inverness, Newport Richey. But there were so many groups that would come into certain areas and play. You know, we had groups from St. Petersburg come, Tampa, and we would cross paths. And some of the people that supposedly we crossed paths with along the way, and we met in different groups, were people like Jim Stafford, who later on had a few hits, and somebody named Lobo, who had some other hits, and Stephen Stills was in the neighborhood. He was down in Tampa, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. Wow. Graham Parsons, who was with the Flying Burrito Brothers and the Byrds, was based out of Winter Haven and would cross paths and so forth. So you never knew. Back then, you know, we were all just trying to get along and having a good time, but it was a wonderful time because we not only had fun, we got paid for it.
Yeah.
And, you know, I guess some of the girls think you're cool or something, and work was hard to find, by the way.
Okay.
And I wanted a brand new Fender Stratocaster.
Nice. And
I wanted the amp, and I wanted the reverb and all this, and so this was going to run me about $600-700, which is a lot of money back then. Mm-hmm. So I said to my buddy Alonzo, we had just started the band. I was playing an old cheap Japanese guitar.
Okay.
And so I wrote a letter to Fender, and I told him, I've been the proud owner of a Fender guitar for many, many years, and the decal has wore off. Could you send me a decal? So I took the decal and I put it on this cheap Japanese guitar. And everybody said, wow, he's got a Fender, you know. But I said, I got to get a real one. So I said to Alonzo, our drummer, he says, I'm going to get a job. I can't find a job, but I got a job in the Groves. And he said, Bobby, I don't know about that. City boy like you, that's pretty rough work. And I said, oh, I can handle it. I'll work for about a month and I'll have me that guitar. So I went there one day, and I swear to God, I had never worked so hard in my life. You know, they had you running from this watering truck, mm-hmm. carrying these big old buckets of water, mm-hmm. back and forth, filling it up, running to the trees, watering the trees, back and forth. So at 10:30 in the morning, my arm's about ready to fall off. And then I had this guy. Did you ever see the movie Cool Hand Luke?
I did not.
Okay, well, there's this guy, the one who says, what we have here is a failure to communicate.
Okay.
And he was like that. He was our boss, our foreman. Mm-hmm. So he said, boy, you didn't bring no water with you, did you? And he said, what's wrong? I said, well, I didn't bring any water because I figured we'd stop by a Pickwick store or something. He says, Pickwick? There ain't going to be no quick pick store within 8 miles of where you're going, boy. So I went out there and I worked, and I was so thirsty. I've never been so thirsty in my life. I had no water. And I said, I got to have some water. And he says, well, you can drink out of my jug. So I looked in that jug that he had, and I looked down, and I see all these black things floating around at the bottom. And I looked at it, and I said, I don't care, I got to have it. So I drank it. It was great. Then finally later on he stopped by at a store in Spring Lake called Lee's Store in the middle of nowhere.
Right. I believe that was at Powell and Spring Lake Highway.
Yes, exactly. And I went in there and I got me a big cherry soda about this big and drank it all down. And I came back, I looked like a drowned rat. I mean, I was dirty, wet. I couldn't get up the next morning to
Wow.
go to work. They paid me $1 an hour. I got $8 that day for all that. And I said, there's got to be a better way. So we had a piano, so I traded it in and got everything. And I'm going to tell you something. I graduated from the University of Florida in 1968. All of my buddies, and a lot of them were from either Miami or Tampa. I made friends up there. All of them left Florida. There was no opportunity in Florida,
Right.
even for those with a college education. And I'm telling you right now, I wanted to go to Miami because I had friends there. So I went to Miami and I was offered a job designing ads for food fair. $76 a week.
Wow.
I said, $76 a week? You got to be kidding me. And they said, we can hire people from up north that are willing to work for this amount. So I left.
Yeah.
And I came back here, ran my parents, my dad had passed away. So I took over his motel business for a while. And then I went into business for myself, putting on rock concerts down in Tampa.
Cool.
And did that for 4 years before I went to the Tribune and worked there for 20 years.
Wow.
But it was really tough. The opportunity for young people back then was really rough, unless you had a family member that had a business. You were pretty much on your own and had to go somewhere else. I really do think that this, like I said at the beginning of this, the residue of the Civil War left the South so devastated that, in essence, I think they were taken advantage of, and they were so it was so rough to recover. It took 100 years to recover, and everybody knew that if you wanted a good paying job, you had to go up north. That's just the way it was.
Where do you see the county going from here on out at this point? I mean, well, before you talked a bit about the development of Spring Hill and how it wasn't a big deal, and now it's turned into, the majority of the county is Spring Hill.
Well, I like to say it's like I mentioned in this, to some people it's a blessing or a curse, depending on who you talk to. I think at one time it had reached its peak probably around 1985 or so. But because of the housing debacle that we just went through, a lot of those homes are just vacant. It looks sad, to be honest with you. And I don't know what's going to happen as far as that's concerned, but I think Florida always has to its advantage that big sun in the sky, and that will always draw people.